the Adventuring Party, 2nd week of May 2020. This week, since we're all trapped in a dark age, the party discussed how the actual dark ages weren't as bad as advertised. The Adventuring Party, discussing tabletop and radio gaming the Irish way.
Welcome to the party. I'm Shane.
I'm Shiv.
And I'm still savage.
Somehow he's still savage. Well, have you not sworn loyalty to the king? Have you not donned your leather cap and gotten a hectare of grain to harvest? What?
I know I remain a free man of the land. I have no liege, no title, and
Satanist!
almost no place.
I'm a hobo/murderer. I mean adventurer. So, taxes, what?
So today we're going to talk about the well from which we mine the mine silver of our generic gaming and fantasy settings. The medieval period, specifically the medieval period of Europe, and just talking about some of the breaks in reality between the assumed fantasy land that so many of our games take place in and the realities of the medieval world that often get overlooked in our rush to generalize, and how these inconsistencies can actually probably prove to be very useful fuel for your next campaign. So, does anyone have random interesting tidbits about medieval life and culture that maybe they think people just aren't as aware of as they should be?
Okay, I guess in a fantasy world it doesn't really matter if you're accurate so long as your audience doesn't know any better anyway or doesn't care. But I guess what you're asking is if there are items that you could incorporate to enrich a fantasy world coming straight from the medieval environment. And for me, the areas that I would look into would be like population density and societal organization. How many people live in towns versus the countryside. How safe was that countryside is probably important for roleplay games. And one of the things making maps in the past that I've come across that surprised me was how many people fit into such a small place in terms of cities and towns in medieval times. So you could see a few miles square fitting thousands of people basically in a city. But that would be maybe 4 or 5% of the population. You'd have a huge amount of space supporting that. And every city needs the support of agricultural land. That sounds kind of like abstract did you knows on the offset, in fairness. But the way that enriches the game for me is understanding who's going to be in the town versus who's going to be in the countryside. What's the structure there? What are the players going to run into when they walk into that town? How dense is it really? Like, where can you tell is different to the modern world? Like, this is actually normal for this universe. But as a player, you might not know that there are 30 people per square mile or more in the land. How many people live in a building, how cramped it all is, and basically how they survive in that way. Like, where does their food come from?
Yeah, I'm reminded of the time I went to Dublinia, and lovely place down by Christchurch, and they have a mock-up of medieval Dublin, and it's this very interesting thing where you walk into this tiny room and you can see like the second story of this well-off person's house, and just kind of squeeze in to his tiny kitchen, which apparently feeds him, his wife, his children, and his servant. And then you walk out into this quite busy street of not that great dimensions, and it's like an alleyway in the modern sense. It's like they were really, really packed in.
Yeah, and what you mentioned about servants as well is interesting, because how many servants lived with their families that they served? Did they have families of their own? All these societal structures, they come from presumptions that we just don't have any context for nowadays.
Just on the cons. First of all, I've got to go see Dublinia now. It's a local attraction here in Dublin. Despite the many years I've lived here, I've never stuck my head inside the door of it because it sounds kind of cool. Coming from Roscommon, I feel I can speak with some authority on a medieval mindset. And but no, to be serious for a second, one of the reasons we're talking about this is because I think everybody who plays a fantasy role playing game or has sort of looked at Dungeons and Dragons or anything else is quite aware at some level of just how poorly it sort of reflects the reality of those times. And we are talking a pretty wide span of time in terms of where influences are drawn from. One of the people we can blame, or one of the groups of people we can blame for that, are the Victorians, who did an awful lot to stunt and hamper and cloud our understanding of what the actual medieval history of our world is, because they were so caught up in their sort of fascination with neoclassicism and the Renaissance that they really did kind of play down the importance, the intelligence, the sheer savvy of the medieval period that came after sort of the Hellenic sort of dynasties, the Greek and Roman Renaissance. And I think it is worth remembering that most of what you know or think you know is probably wrong, but a lot of it is folded into Dungeons and Dragons and has to be worked with or enhanced rather than stripped away entirely. Like the Shiv, your point of population density is absolutely fascinating, and the movement of people inside a city or outside a city and how they would have interacted or the range they would have moved across, I think is we make weird assumptions based on some very dodgy kind of initial premises. And what you're saying about just how packed cities would have been and just how much farmland would have surrounded them and just how many of those people would have transitioned from day to day is really worth thinking about, because it gives huge texture to a world. So you all of a sudden, instead of you arrive at the city walls and everyone in the city just sort of lives in there, you arrive at a city and as you pass by, you're encountering farmstead after farmstead and you're seeing huge amounts of trade flowing in and out of the city. And as night falls, enormous influx of people that are going into the city and some that are coming out. So these are busy periods. And we think of traffic jams and commutes as something that only happens in the modern world, but a lot of evidence to support that there were periods in any given day when city streets would have been absolutely jammed, and then other times where you might have had a fairly free run of things.
And travel is actually another interesting one. Like the stats and background to building a map, the information is invisible to the players, but it does help you flesh out a map that's more convincing and more interesting. But what's probably more relevant to them is how long does it take them to get from one location to the other. And I don't know about you guys, but in my games, we tend to have this thing called narrative. This takes narrative time. How long does it take to get to the next town? Narrative time, whatever makes sense in the story. But it doesn't make sense in reality necessarily. But how do you bring tension to that when you can just get there whenever you feel?
I did recently run a leg of a campaign that was all about travelling from one place to the other, and I had to sort of break a few arms to convince the players that the best thing to do was go over land. So yeah, you're always going to face that that difficulty of okay, well, this guy can teleport, fine. What about the rest of us? So, but in the course of that travel, it gave me a great opportunity to introduce lots of little vignettes of life outside of the big city. And as they went further and further away from the air quotes civilization of that world, and then traveled, and local customs and things became sort of an issue. And I think that's the great thing about the medieval world. It is a period of time when there is trade and travel, but regional matters are the most important matters. And over the course of any extended period of travel, you are not just going to travel inside of a kingdom, but you're going to cover a few different regions that might have very different outlooks and rules, and you can use that to inject some interest into the game, to bring in side quests, things like that. And the medieval period is perfect for this because, as you say, like, travel within a region might be fairly frequent. Travel beyond those places is for a select few.
And have you ever run into the situation where you've made assumptions that you thought everybody in the party would buy into, and it's just caused confusion in the end? Things like travel time,
Yes.
but also just things like what's normal and what isn't normal in a medieval setting.
Big time, yeah. Trying to... what's the best example? I suppose what really struck them... This is not so much an assumption as maybe exercising a bit of thought that hadn't occurred or hadn't fully outlined, is that currency was often incredibly regional in the medieval world. So
That's true.
you could spend sort of guild coin in a town or in a city, and then you try and pass it 100 miles down the road, and people there are like, what's this stuff? It's no good to me. So there was a bit of back and forth. Now that does come down to that's perhaps not a useful thing to inject into a game, because it just complicates things. You don't want to sort of open a fantasy bureau de change. So I think I'm going to look at the medieval period and think to myself, what's here that I kind of didn't know and didn't realize, or what assumptions have I made? The biggest one I run into is assumptions about the homogeneous nature of people's language, faith, and ethnicity. Like, we're so often given a picture of the medieval world where everybody, they don't all share the same surname, but they're almost certainly all look the same. And this is an argument I've made on this show in the past that is demonstrably untrue. After you go any sort of distance at all in the medieval world, you're going to run into people who have a different faith, who speak different languages, but probably you share a language with, and quite likely have come from further afield than you might expect. So, have different skin or have a different sort of mode of dress.
So cultural homogeny is really a modern thing.
Yeah.
In fairness, yeah. I mean, the transfer of information and also kind of the active pursuit of governments to homogenize the culture within their country as a sort of maybe a propaganda system or some sort of way of bringing people together. That's not probably as common the further back you go and the less communication you have.
I think one thing that tripped me up when I started looking up some classics is most of the Arthurian legends were actually written in France. Like, Lancelot is pretty explicitly meant to be French. And also, this always trips me up with, like, one of the Knights of the Round Table is a North African fellow really? Called Palamedes. Actually, he's sort of the Javert to Tristan and Isolde. So yeah, he has a pretty substantial role. I mean, I think they have a line explaining that he's converted from Islam or something. But other than that, yeah.
Oh, lovely bit of propaganda there. Yeah, but I suppose that is so. And to bring that to the table, that is like if you're playing a half orc or a tiefling or a dragon man. And your GM sort of hits you with this, you arrive in the village and people are staring at you and kind of think you're strange. You might interject that, well, look, we're all over the place. We travel everywhere. It's not unusual to see us, or to see people of these races. The muck-raking seraph of popular sort of medieval tropes is not as astounded by the fact that you're black or lizardy or a tiger person as some might assume.
That's true. They're all like that over on the other side of the hills, right? Aren't they?
So general ignorance, you think that's overplayed in medieval settings?
That's a tricky one. In certain circumstances, yes. I think there's a lot we think about the medieval mindset that we attribute as ignorance, and really, I think a medieval person is going to be very focused on their own region. is going to be aware of the comings and goings and doings of other regions, but maybe not with any great degree of accuracy. They're not going to be as astounded by differences in race and religion, but things like currency are going to be sort of very, like, they're going to look at the coins you brought in.
I would argue that not everybody necessarily lived on a trade route in medieval times. You would have backwater places off the beaten track that might be an interesting location from an adventuring perspective.
Yeah, you've got both options. Like, we can, even in the modern world, there are reports of places in the Middle East where you might go as a white person and be referred to as a Roman. So this is not, we're not confining this to any sort of period of history. But I think it's important to be able to play with both in the toolbox. That there's very cosmopolitan places in the medieval world. And there are places that absolutely, like, everybody's the same second name.
Yeah.
And you can have I think you can have a lot of fun with that, because it forces your players to shift their mode of thought to deal with one or the other. And like a player, it forces the characters to deal with it as well, but it forces the players to sort of consider how worldly they might be compared to these poor yokels, and how they might still be potential to be outshone in places where there's a lot more going on than they might expect. Like, you might be hot in your own pocket duchy, but when you arrive in the big city, you discover that there's many, many, many more levels of adventuring ahead of you.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it, actually, because I was thinking more in terms of background characters, but changing the mindset of your players and making them realize how little they know and how little of the world they're actually really aware of could be a really good way of getting them immersed in a narrative or in a game setting.
And gives them goals. Like, those players are going to latch onto that and say, right, now I need to find out absolutely everything there is to know about toad people. Didn't even know there were toad people until yesterday.
They seem nice, though.
Yeah.
Have you seen them eat? Shane, speaking of odd people, do you have any bugbears about fantasy medieval sort of tropes that you'd like to slay right now?
Bugbears is a strong word. I do think that we tend to oversimplify the dynamic between the adventuring groups and their relationship to the world around them. We sort of just kind of gloss over the details because we were trying to let's rush off to the dungeon, and there's all kinds of things that we should probably take a look at more, just to mine for ideas and interesting complications. For example, who owns that dungeon? That's the thing that never comes up, because that dungeon exists on land, right? It's under the land, but it's still the property of Baron such and such. Do we need his permission to go in? Does he have like a fellow at the front door charging 5 gold pieces the same when he comes in? So if they come back with a cart full of diamonds, is there suddenly a new tax being passed about carts full of diamonds?
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing, is like, you don't want to overdo this, because if you overdo anything, you'll just end up with rebellions, which, to be fair, were a lot more common than people realized in the medieval times, especially since technically a bunch of guys just beating up the local sheriff for not doing his job, it technically counts as a rebellion.
Who's in charge this week?
Yeah.
Because these are all appointed officials, of course. So
yeah,
they could get unappointed if they don't get it right. I really hadn't thought about that, but yeah, peasant revolt is a phrase that we kind of could use to great effect in any given game. What if the local lord's quest for your party is go put down a peasant revolt?
Yeah,
and they arrive, and the peasants have a very good case to make. I don't think you can treat a town full of angry farmers and merchants the same way you might treat a dungeon full of uppity goblins.
sorry, speaking of the peasants and peasant revolts and how much power lies with the peasants versus the nobility, trade is something that I found very awkward in a lot of fantasy roleplay games. Like, who actually has the money to buy that stuff off of you?
Oh yeah, I just had to put a hard stop and say there is no magic item shop in this. Like that stuff does not have a price tag. It'd be like trying to sell the Mona Lisa. There's only one of it, and everybody wants it. It's more often than not going to have story and excitement attached to it rather than here's some cash. Now that brings all sorts of other problems into it, but D&D economics are something we've talked about before. And okay, is there anything interesting about medieval economics that we could inject into a game that doesn't necessarily barter? Actually, very good.
That's all I can think. I mean, rather than giving them useful objects, give them objects that they can barter for something they'd prefer.
Trade goods as treasure. That's one of the things that just got to fall out of favor. The things of instead of having all your non-magical treasure be like coins and diamonds and such, you could just have it so that the goblins have stolen a wagon full of onions, silks.
Sounds better.
Wax.
Right time of year, onions are very valuable.
Yeah.
Wax, yeah. Wow, I think there's a lot of that in games like Mount and Blade.
I love that game.
And you see it pop up a lot in OSR stuff where you look at the sort of the magic or the loot on offer, and very often it is going to be carved statuettes or a bolt of silk cloth, things like that. So yeah, there's and it's kind of interesting to watch players scratch their heads over that. Well, how do I record this by character sheet in terms of gold coins?
Yeah, it's sort of the two-edged sword of the old style treasure reading, is that part of the challenge was supposed to be, how do I pick this stuff up and how do I get it back to town to sell, and then who do I sell it to?
I do like the fact that that translates really neatly into, if it isn't gold coins in your pocket, then it's stuff in your backpack that could be useful in some other way. So it could be that later on you need a strong rope, and you just happen to have this bolt of silk. Well, if we cut it up and do a little bit of crafting on it, we've got really strong rope that we didn't have before. Won't be able to sell it, but we've got the rope we need now. That's a way of MacGyvering through your loot.
Yeah, lots of different things. Like, you can get surprising amount of uses out of wax if you try hard enough.
And that I suppose brings me to medieval industry, which there was plenty of. I mean, those towns and cities that Shiv describes weren't just full of merchants and nobles. They were often, the reason that they had so many people in them was because they were gathered there to work on something, and these could be sort of small or large industries.
Textile.
That's the big one, I think.
Fun one. Yeah, I suppose there's a few other, we've talked quite a lot and we haven't touched on a huge amount of different topics like combat, gender, things like that just didn't exist, like certain colours and fabrics, like vivid purples and magentas and fabrics that didn't exist.
Do your magenta thing.
Yeah, my magenta thing. It's little flavour things where you give, again, the players a sense, a perspective. You have to tell them what the perspective is first, and then the colour pink is actually amazing and shocking. But if you just throw it in there to a modern audience, they're just like, yeah, it's magenta, what?
I'll drop a link to some YouTube stuff on magenta, because it's something I've come across before, and just why it's such a wildly sort of interesting colour, or not colour. And the idea that in the medieval world, as you say, I think purple was the other one, that some colours are very rare because they couldn't be manufactured easily.
Certainly in fabrics and things like that, yeah.
So they've huge significance. And colour was hugely significant in the medieval mindset because it could often denote rank or a place in society. Colour was widely used by the church. So cathedrals were riots of colour. And, you watch Game of Thrones or you watch something set in the medieval period and everything's kind of brown and grey. But the reality was that medieval people did everything they could to make their lives colourful.
Mm-hmm.
Look at those Landsknechts, those mercenaries from Germany who would wear the most ridiculous puffy shirts, and that was deliberate. They were showing, hey, I can afford a big, colourful, puffy shirt. It was a status symbol, and that kind of thing is very common.
Yeah.
Big hats were the thing, because then to prove that you could afford a big hat, and you could get your big hat delivered from Big Hatistan over the hills.
There's so many other things to talk about, and we're drawing close to time. I suppose, so festivals and feasting days are another thing you can inject into a game. Almost anywhere you go at any time of year in the medieval world, you're either just after, just before, or in the middle of some sort of religious observance or festival to do with pagan custom, or just something local, commemorate a local event. And you can have all sorts of fun with that. Some of these survive in the modern world. So if you were to travel to certain parts of Ireland at a certain time of year, you might stumble across a goat being kept in a tower for a few days at the Puck Fair. And this is cause for celebration for reasons that remain unclear. But it is a period of a few days in a year where the town is full of people. There's lots of things going on. A ripe sort of field for adventurers to sort of arrive into and go. Anything, some minor stuff from, well, we need to get this done before the end of the fair, or someone has stolen King Puck, the goat. We need to get him back before anyone notices. You can have lots of fun with festivals and just their organisation and the influence they might have on a local peasantry or nobles or whatever. There might be indulgences being given out, or this festival might coincide with a time where crimes are forgiven. Because let's face it, murder hobos are probably more in need of forgiveness from the law than anyone else.
Turns into the purge very quickly. Do we want to talk about which games we think do the best job of this sort of medieval mindset?
I guess it does come down to something we talked about in preparation, is like how much does it matter to you and your players?
It's not just how much does it matter. It's some elements of reality could actually make the game less fun. And I think that it's really important to keep that in mind, because like going back to gender, for example, Wolf Rub I think is the only game that I've ever felt like I needed to dress up as a man in order to kind of get by in my role. And that can be really interesting to do, but not everybody wants to play that in a fantasy every single time. Sometimes it's just nicer to put a world that's more flexible mindsets, and allows you to play out your fantasy and have that escapism.
Absolutely, like that 100 times, because and it sort of goes back to my points about the idea that the medieval world is much more multilingual, much more multi-faith than we give them credit for. Now, it is true that depending on where you are in the medieval world, your gender is going to be a huge indicator of what you can and can't do. And that's one I absolutely think you jettison when it comes to playing a game, because it is only when it makes things more interesting that I think we should try and adhere or lift from the reality. And if you're willing to put up with toad people and bear men, then the idea that there's some boobs on the breastplate shouldn't faze you in the slightest.
I mean, again, I wouldn't necessarily jettison it, but if you're going to use it on purpose and make sure you know what the system
use
is.
It in a positive way, in that, in ways we see in plenty of fiction, that you could look at things like the Bene Gesserit in Dune, which is a series that is set in space but has a very medieval mindset, well worth mining for ideas.
Yeah.
Or the Sisters of Battle in Warhammer 40,000. Like, you can build all sorts of things around gender, but I think the important thing is not to dwell too much on the negative.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the same with the language, for example, and regional currencies. They can be interesting if you're using them for a reason, but don't just put it in there just because it's realistic, because it's going to annoy the hell out of your players and probably you eventually.
Yes, the thing about languages is it's much more likely that you can find someone to speak to than not, because and literacy as well. There's a lot of indications in recent historical sort of endeavours that even the peasantry in medieval times were probably a lot more literate than we give them credit for. So, yeah, the idea that you're going to turn up in a town and no one can read the book you've brought with you and no one has a clue what you're saying is probably more far-fetched than anything else we've talked about.
Yeah, I do like one of the touches in when I'm looking up my Greyhawk material is that almost everyone speaks common, but they also tend to have their own regional dialects. Like only the actual city of Greyhawk is where common is the language. You go 50 miles each and you're in Nyrond, where they speak Nyrondese. And there's Kyoish if you go to the west. It's like the lingua franca as a concept is a very important one in the medieval times. So yeah, there will be these pidgin languages that everyone speaks, and it is perfectly fine to say you're from a region where you know this pretty well.
And to flip that on its head, it's also a time when there were very specific modes of speech and writing that were tied to certain pursuits around religion or warfare or trade. So it is possible for your druid to get approached by someone who speaks to them in the language of the druids, and none of the rest of the party understand, and it's up to your druid to to juggle that interaction.
Yeah, it can be quite good to have a linguist.
Yeah, allowing you to push sort of interactions towards players or characters that might not necessarily always get the spotlight outside of combat or something like that. I think it's handy to be able to sort of give them a chance to, if the players express an interest, to step in, and you can use secret languages or guild languages or high religious language as ways of exploring that. And all of those were concepts that would sit very safely or easily in the medieval period.
Yeah, and just to jump off that point, the idea of talking to someone was not very weird. The idea that you would have some common language somewhere among your retainers, and you could send it off and talk with this foreign king and talk to him about why he's showed up your land with 10,000 people. That was entirely doable, and it was something people did first, because just going to war, as much as they might say they loved war and loved all the war making, mostly they loved winning. The dying part, not so much. So it's very possible that when that warlord, hobgoblin warlord and his army of manticores show up, that you're not sent to kill them straight away. That the Baron sends you with a message, and you're here to avoid starting a fight, not just deal with the problem.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes talking to the monsters could work. Diplomacy and negotiation and perhaps setting the terms of an engagement were all preambles to medieval war that we could drag into the game and kind of see if we can make some of that work. Yeah. Shiv, any hobby horse for this one? Anything you want to highlight before we finish up?
I guess now, just to reiterate that it's all about adding texture and not adding kind of complexity, meaningless complexity. I think that's the focus. Yeah,
there's enough to be tracking in a game that involves combat and magic and long rests and encumbrance that we don't need to add any more complexity. But I think we should strive to try and emulate some of the interesting sort of aspects of the medieval world in the background, probably, or in choices that we make for our characters. Medieval mindset is something that's sometimes used as a negative term. I think there's something to be said for looking at the medieval mindset and looking at how you might map it onto a game with a sort of a magical realism or fantasy to it, in that magic is known and is believed in, and the gods are broad and are believed in, and that in many ways is very hard for our modern mindset to really engage with. But we can look to the medieval period to get a better idea of how people framed their thought around a world where the four humours were a thing, and miasmas and spirits and a very real and visceral relationship with their god and other people's gods was the norm. It is, and it's often very. I use. We discussed plague and disease in the previous episode, and I think I kind of hammered away at that idea that thinking about this in terms of, if you're a player at a game that this sort of stuff comes up, thinking about it instantly in terms of, well, I've got to wash my hands, or I've got to exercise correct hygiene, is probably short selling the game a little bit, in that you could engage with this in a much more interesting way, and something that would feed into that different sense of place and time.
Yeah, like very often, like the medieval person would figure out how something worked first, and then sort of backfill in. Well, the important men in the castle say there's only one god, and there's no such thing as fairies. So I have to come up with some way of squaring this circle, and getting what is obviously in front of my face to make sense with the belief system that I sort of inherited from my culture. So they were a bit more inventive about how to get things to make sense to them than we sometimes give credit for. But yeah, they did definitely have their own mindset that they sort of had to work in, and you can't just throw all that out because it's inconvenient for the player who just wants to give this shopkeep 10,000 gold pieces and expect a +2 sword from.
Yeah, very good. Okay. Shane, do you want to take us out?
Well, if you have 37 very, very interesting books on the medieval period that you think we definitely need to read in detail and put straight into our Forgotten Realms games, you can hit us up in our social media. You can speak to us on our Discord, on our SpeakPipe service, or you can @ us on Twitter, or email the party directly. Whatever you want to do, don't worry, it will not take 14 days on a donkey cart and a week's perilous journey by sea. We're right here. We're always available, and we're not so intractable and Luddite-ish as you might expect us to be. For the time being, fare thee well, brave yeomen, and this party's over.
Thanks for listening to The Adventure Party. You can find show notes and links to the mentioned at www.theadventureparty.net and on our Facebook page. You can leave comments there, or talk to our Twitter account @AdventurePTY, or you can record a voice message at www.speakpipe.com/theadventureparty. The host can be contacted directly by email at Shiv, Savage and scar@theadventureparty.net. If you'd like to be in touch with the party all the time, come join our Discord server. Links in the show notes. The Adventure Party will feature a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike 50p license.